Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales, a layman's history of war. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our second episode. Today we're going to finally get into the meat of our history, because the Bronze Age is when military history really begins, when recognizable armies pursuing recognizable goals operated in opposition to other recognizable armies. Maybe more importantly, it's the period of history when we start seeing records of events, where people sought to help others remember what happened, when rulers first started trying to make themselves immortal in songs and stories and stone carvings and massive building projects. Well, at least when these records survive to come down to us in such a form that we understand what they are. So today, we're talking about the oldest record we have of a battle, the Siege of Uruk, sometime around 2600 BCE. But just like we did with the Stone Age, we have to spend some time talking about the Bronze Age before we can get into today's battle. So what was the Bronze Age, and when, and what makes it special? In a nutshell then, the Bronze Age was the age in history when we stopped using stone for tools and weapons and started using metal. But why is that a big deal? Well, metal does something even the best stone tools can't do. It can bend and flex without breaking. That means you can make tools that last longer, that hold their edge, that don't shatter when your technique isn't perfect, which ultimately means you can make blades and cutting edges thinner and longer without sacrificing durability. And in general, a longer, thinner blade is useful for more tasks than a shorter, thicker blade. Not to mention, it's lighter. But not just any metal will do. You need a metal with the right combination of hardness and flexibility. That's why you can't use gold or silver. Even if they weren't relatively rare, they're too soft to make useful tools. You need a metal that's hard enough not to deform so far with use that it won't spring back into shape, because a metal that doesn't hold its shape is no more useful than stone. So we figured out how to make jewelry from gold sometime in the 4000s BCE, even before some of the battle sites we talked about in the Stone Age episode. But we didn't figure out how to use metal for tools until 1,000 years later. It started with copper. We don't think of copper as a very good metal for tools today because we have lots of better options. But when Ötzi the Iceman, once again not his real name, was alive around 3200 BCE, it was the state of the art. Copper is relatively plentiful. It has a relatively low melting point, which makes it easy to extract from rock and easy to shape, and it holds its edge better than stone. But not that much better. If you look at Ötzi's tools, you'll notice his copper axe looks a lot like a Paleolithic polished stone axe, with a blade that looks much too small to be useful by our standards. Certainly, compared to a steel axe, it's close to useless. But to him, it was a big deal. A very useful tool and weapon, and probably an indicator of status as well. But he still carried a stone knife, and his arrows had stone tips, which speaks to how limited copper is when it comes to useful tools. Which is why most of us have never heard of the Copper Age. It was short, and it's really only useful to historians and archaeologists as a transitional period between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. So how did we get to the Bronze Age in the first place? Well, copper gave us the proof of concept, if you will. Metal was useful, but not a game changer. You can kind of imagine crusty old-timers in the Copper Age sticking with their stone tools, making fun of the guys trying to get the metal out of the rock and make tools out of it. You can imagine a John Henry type bragging about making 10 stone axes in the time it takes a smith to smelt and make one copper axe. You can imagine a craftsman napping flint for blades, scoffing at the young warrior showing off his copper axe. He still needs flint for a good knife, after all. But bronze changed the game. With bronze, you can make blades that look a lot like our modern blades, knives and spearheads, long enough to replace napped or polished stone blades, then surpass them. In the Bronze Age, we get the world's first swords. We had to shape the blades like backward sickles to make them strong enough to withstand the shock of a blow, but they are recognizable as swords. Later, we learned how to hammer it thin enough to make armor out of it, armor stronger than the toughest leather. But there were a lot of steps between Ötzi's copper axe and a bronze sickle sword. We mentioned already that copper is relatively plentiful and relatively easy to smelt from rock. But bronze doesn't come from rock. It's an alloy of copper and tin, which means in order to make it, you have to figure out how to get both copper and tin ores out of the ground, then smelt them, then combine them in the right proportions to make a good alloy. Then you have to shape that. And there's another wrinkle to the whole thing. See, copper is plentiful, but tin only comes from a few places, none of which are in the area we call Mesopotamia, that part of modern-day Iraq and Syria that we consider the birthplace of Western civilization. Or in Egypt, where bronze came into widespread use at about the same time. China has its own sources of tin nearby, and the use of bronze there began within a few centuries of its advent in Mesopotamia, but the nearest major sources of tin to Mesopotamia are in Spain and Cornwall to the west and the north, and in Afghanistan to the east. None of these sources is less than 2,000 miles from where we find the earliest bronze tools and weapons. Bottom line is this: we had to invent international trade before we could cast bronze in anything like the kinds of quantities we need to outfit an army. Which doesn't mean all that much to us in this show, since we're not looking at trade except as it pertains to military operations down the line. But I've always found it interesting, and it's my show after all. So, that story you heard in your history class where the Stone Age yielded inevitably to the Bronze Age and the whole thing took about 5 minutes, yeah, it was a little more complicated than that. So what else do we need to know about the Bronze Age? 2 things. First, eventually we're going to get into the part of the Bronze Age where a crazy new technology called writing becomes available, which allows us for the first time to have the words of historical figures directly, which gives us another direct source of information to compare with what the archaeology tells us. And second, most of the events we're about to study come with a generous helping of myth and legend, muddying the waters and making it difficult to understand what really happened. Those 2 points seem a little bit contradictory, but they're not. Not really. Because writing came along after the Bronze Age had been in full swing for a while, and most of the early written sources we have fall into just a couple of categories. Commercial records, attempts to capture older spoken word legends and stories, and kings bragging about, recording, their great deeds and accomplishments. 2 of those, I'll let you guess which 2, are somewhat likely to be exaggerated. And the more time had passed between the first telling and the first writing, the greater the exaggeration. That's where this week's battle comes from. The story of the Siege of Uruk comes to us from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the earliest known written legend. The epic was written down sometime in the 1600s BCE, but any historical events it captures likely happened 1,000 years earlier, which goes a long way toward explaining how the Gilgamesh in the epic is basically a superhero, while the real King Gilgamesh, assuming he existed, was probably just a really talented dude. All that said, it looks like the part of the epic that deals with the Siege of Uruk may be the part most likely based on a real event. The epic is divided into 5 poems, one of which deals with the siege, and that's the one part that doesn't make Gilgamesh out to be a superhero. Scholars have tried to place the siege in history, and sometime around 2600 BCE, the empire of Kish, the invaders in this part of the poem, fell. But Uruk continued as a going concern under various names for more than 3,000 years, until the 600s CE. That's not a lot of information to go on. But it's what we have, and if we want to talk about Bronze Age battles at all, we're going to have to learn to deal with a little uncertainty. So what do we know about the Siege of Uruk? First, let's back up and talk a little bit about the world looked like around Uruk in the early Bronze Age. Uruk sits on the east bank of the Euphrates River, about halfway between the modern-day cities of Basra and Baghdad. The earliest city ruins at Uruk have been dated to around 5000 BCE, so it was already a city in the Neolithic period, 1700 years before Ötzi went down in the Alps. That makes it probably one of the world's oldest cities. By the 3000s BCE, it was part of what we call the Sumerian culture. the earliest civilization we know of to span more than a single city. It seems likely that Uruk was in some sense the capital of Sumer, at least for a while, and it was certainly an important urban center. Kish, another prominent city of the region, lay a little more than 100 miles north of Uruk, a little east of the modern-day city of Hela. Gilgamesh ruled as king of Uruk sometime between 2700 and 2500 BCE, when Aga, the king of Kish, sent him an offer he thought he couldn't refuse. He figured it would be a good idea if the people of Uruk spent their time digging wells for Kish. See, Uruk and Kish both sit in the region of Iraq we call the Fertile Crescent, a wide green area surrounded by the vast deserts of what today we call the Middle East. Watered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, it's a beautiful country, but it's hot as hell. So wells are important. But they're important no matter who or where you are, not just if you're from Kish. So Gilgamesh didn't think much of Aga's demand. He took it to the city fathers like a good king, and they advised him to submit. It says something about the relative power of Kish and Uruk. At that time, the city fathers thought their best course of action was to allow themselves to become slaves. It also says the city fathers of Uruk probably didn't expect they would be the ones digging the wells, that they probably didn't think their lives would change all that much. After all, they were the elites, and as Lord Farquaad taught us, the elites are often willing to make sacrifices that affect the common folks. So we can imagine that their advice to Gilgamesh was not without a healthy dose of self-interest. Now Gilgamesh, for his part, wasn't having it. He gave the city fathers the full Nick Fury. I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it. So, hedging their bets again, they named him Lugal, or Big Man, one of the titles of a Sumerian king, and told him to go for it. The epic puts a little speech in Gilgamesh's mouth at this point, a speech that shows us a little bit about Bronze Age warfare. Speaking to his servant Enkidu, he is supposed to have said, "On this account, let the weaponry and arms of battle be made ready. Let the battle mace return to your side. May they create a great terror and radiance. When he comes, my great fearsomeness will overwhelm him. His reasoning will become confused and his judgment disarrayed." Sounds an awful lot like lock and load, let's kick some ass. It also tells us something about Sumerian weaponry. The epic mentions battle maces in several places, spears and axes in a few, a sword once or twice. In 2600 BCE, the maces would probably have been glorified clubs. Many of the heads would have been made of stone, especially for the weapons of common soldiers. Spears may be the world's longest lived weapon, and maybe the hand weapon that's killed more people than any other, if you count a musket or rifle with a bayonet attached as a spear. Would have looked a lot like they did almost 4,000 years later, but with leaf-shaped heads of copper or bronze instead of steel. Axes would have been recognizable, but the softness of bronze would have made the heads much smaller than they would become when iron and steel replaced bronze. Think of a weapon a little more like a tomahawk than a battle axe. And a sword would have looked a lot like a long dagger. This was probably before the invention of the sickle sword, and would probably have been a true status weapon, only carried by Gilgamesh and Aga themselves. I couldn't find a reference to say for sure whether or not Gilgamesh replied to Aga's message, but a few days after he sent the message, Aga showed up at the walls of Uruk with his army. How many days isn't clear, but since Kish and Uruk are about 100 miles apart, moving an army of any significant size would have been a major undertaking. If they had good roads and logistical support, they could probably do it in 4 or 5 days of hard marching. Maybe faster if they traveled down the river in boats, but then they have to embark and disembark, not to mention the time it would take to collect or commandeer enough boats to make the trip. So, in order to show up at Uruk less than 10 days after Uruk received his message, Aga would probably have had to march before he could receive any reply. So what would he have marched with? The epic doesn't make it clear, but sources from later periods, including carvings called stelae, the earliest of which date to about 2500 BCE, indicate Sumerian armies could number between 3,000 and 6,000 with a core of professional soldiers stiffening a force of mostly temporary conscripts, men who were called up for military service when needed and who pursued non-military occupations the rest of the time. It's a little bit of a stretch to assume the armies of 2600 BCE were identical in equipment and organization to the armies of 2500 BCE. If that doesn't make sense to you, compare the U.S. Army of 1924 to the Army of 2024. Similar, but not the same. But 2500 BCE is the closest evidence we have, so it's what we have to go with. So Aga probably had around 5,000 men, of whom 500 or 600 were professionals. The professionals would have been mostly heavy infantry, equipped with spears, maces, and helmets, and might have deployed in some kind of close order formation. Let's imagine, since we really don't have anything better, an 8-man front, 6 men deep. They might have had leather capes studded with bronze discs for armor. You can imagine some grumbling as they prepared to form up for battle as they dropped whatever traveling gear they had and swung those hot, heavy capes around their shoulders. We also know the Sumerians used an early form of chariot with 4 wheels instead of the later 2-wheeled version that you're probably familiar with. The chariots would have been pulled by onagers, an equine species a little bigger than donkeys, so they would have been slow. Aga probably would have ridden to battle in one of these 4-wheeled chariots with a driver to direct it. Other chariots would have had similar crews, one man to drive and the other to loose arrows or throw javelins at the enemy. That's what the later stelae show us, but many ancient representations only show the elite core of the army, the flashy guys whose lives were about training and fighting. Think about the war stories we tell these days. Some are about common grunts, but how many more are about SEALs or Green Berets or fighter pilots? So, what did the unsexy grunts look like? Many of them would have been light infantry, armed with spears or maces, maybe carrying smaller shields. We know the Sumerians had bows, but the epic doesn't mention them. Some of these guys would have had nothing but a sling. If they had a militia organization that was anything like it would become centuries later, individual units might have been raised and trained and equipped and led by wealthy patrons, so their equipment and training would probably have been different depending on what their patrons could afford. So 500 or so well-equipped professionals. If he had 50 chariots, that's another 100 men to drive and crew them, and another 4,400 conscripts, lightly armed and armored. Maybe the 4,400 carried the spare gear and food and water for the professionals on the march, or maybe they had servants to do that for them. Maybe the chariot drivers were responsible for taking care of their onagers themselves, or maybe they brought servants to do that, as well as extra pack animals and carts to haul fodder. Of course, more animals means more people to tend and drive them, and you need herds to feed the thousands of people you now have marching to Uruk, which means more people to drive and manage the herds. And you need cooks and craftsmen who know how to repair weapons and chariots and carts and shoes and armor and the 100 other types of tools and equipment such a large group of people would need to carry. So a 5,000-man army means 10 or 15 or even 20,000 people on the march. Or the army was really just the core of 500 fighting professionals, and the rest were there to support them. The point is, it's a little hard to figure out the size of a historical army without detailed records. An army of 5,000 fighting men is a whole different animal than an army with 5,000 men in it. A little detective work can help us here. The population of a major Sumerian city might have been 30,000 people or more. Some estimates put the size of major Sumerian cities as high as 80,000, and both Uruk and Kish were major cities. If we assume Kish had something like 50,000 people, then a 5,000-man army is reasonable. 20,000 is a little bit of a stretch. So, Aga had 5,000 men under his command, of whom 500 or so would actually fight. What did Gilgamesh have? Since the city fathers wanted to accept Aga's terms, we can assume they were afraid of a confrontation, which means either Aga had a reputation for winning, or they expected to be outnumbered in the field. There's nothing in the epic about Aga being particularly fearsome. From the translation I found, he's mentioned only as the son of Enmebaragezi before he shows up at Uruk with his army. So the city fathers of Uruk probably expected his army to be much bigger than theirs. Which means Uruk must have been the smaller city. Let's say Uruk has a population of 40,000, with a similar proportion of professional soldiers as Kish. That means 400 trained fighting men. But a city defending itself has several advantages over its attacker. For one, it has access to a larger proportion of its population for fighting. Its people are near home and have access to food reserves, water wells, and cooking and repair services that aren't available to the attackers. And the people who do this cooking and repairs don't have to march 100 miles to do it, which means they can be younger and older, which means you can have more of your able-bodied young men defending the city. Another advantage is the city wall. An archaeological expedition to Uruk in 1912 discovered the remains of a brick wall estimated at 40 or 50 feet high around the entire city. The epic mentions Gilgamesh standing on this wall. I can't find a mention of how thick it was, but even a couple of feet would be enough to slow down an army until they could construct ladders tall enough to scale or battering rams big enough to breach the wall. And untrained people with slings and rocks can make a 40-foot wall hard to approach. So, an army of 500 men attacking a fortified position defended by 400 is far from a done deal. In fact, it's not something a modern army would be likely to try, which means there's something going on here that I don't understand. Maybe a scholar of Mesopotamian military operations could tell us why Aga thought he could successfully attack Uruk. But from the information I have, I can't see how it makes sense militarily. Of course, that's if it's a one-on-one fight between Kish and Uruk. There is one way the siege makes military sense, which also makes sense of a part of the epic that we'll get to in a few minutes. See, there were quite a few smaller Sumerian city-states in the Fertile Crescent between Kish and Uruk. If Aga had already conquered or allied with several of them and compelled them to help in his military adventures, he could have added their armies to his own. Such alliances would also have allowed him to march his troops through friendly territory and made provisioning easier as well. And he could have hit Uruk with considerably more than 500 men. We'll come back to this idea in a little bit. So let's just see what the epic tells us. What follows is the story in the epic, with quite a bit of embellishment based on my understanding of how a siege might have gone down in the Bronze Age. No shit, there they were. Aga arrived at Uruk and laid siege. The epic says Uruk's reasoning became confused, which probably means the people began to panic. 5,000 people showing up at your doorstep, even if they're not all going to fight, is enough to inspire that kind of reaction. And if they showed up with little warning, they could certainly wreak havoc in the outskirts of the city. The same sources that tell us there were 40,000 people in Uruk also tell us there may have been 80,000 more in the surrounding area. How Aga dealt with these people could go a long way to explaining the siege itself. If they had enough warning to grab their valuables and their herds and get into the city would suddenly have become very crowded. If he started attacking them, refugees would have started streaming into the city, and the sights and sounds of bloodshed and burning farms would add terror to the crowding. And if he enlisted the people of the outskirts to help him with his siege, whether bringing them on as volunteers or drafting them against their will, well, the inhabitants of Uruk are now substantially outnumbered. Any of these, or some combination, would contribute to the chaos and confusion the epic tells us about. And now we have a city that's comfortable for 40,000, and its population has suddenly doubled or more. Its streets are choked with livestock. Its homes and public buildings are crowded with people who have suddenly lost everything but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could grab before running to the shelter of the city walls. The ones who lived closest, maybe worked inside the city, would have had the best chance to reach safety. Those who lived farther out would have had less warning. Depending on how stealthy Aga's approach was, they might not have known they were in danger until their fields were burning. Some died before they could reach the walls. Some surrendered, hoping maybe their new overlords wouldn't be that much different from their old ones. Some were caught before they could run. Maybe the able-bodied among the last two groups were impressed into work crews and set to collecting food and booty, and preparing Aga's camp. The young women would have been pressed into different kinds of gangs to perform a different kind of service for Aga's men. Those not fit to work, the old, the very young, the sick and lame and injured might have been killed outright. The clouds of smoke, the rape, the slaughter, even some of the screams would have been perceptible to the people inside the city. The world they knew that morning was gone by the afternoon. Small wonder if confusion and panic reigned in the city. So here's where King Gilgamesh earned his money, or his grain, or his salt, or the trust and regard of his people. It's not entirely clear how Sumerian kings might have been compensated for their service. But when the world is going to shit, the capacity of a strong leader to stay calm is worth more than just about anything. A leader who loses his cool, who yells and screams and takes out his fear on those around him, hurts his people as much as any enemy action could. And then there are those leaders who step up and offer a solution. Those who straighten up in the face of what looks like impossible odds and say just the right thing to show not only are they not panicking, they are confident of victory. Leaders like that act like they know exactly what to do even if they don't, because a leader who shows confidence in his soldiers will quickly earn their confidence. We like to know somebody knows what's going on and how to deal with it, and will follow the guy who acts like it. I like to imagine a conversation that goes something like this. The soldier runs up to the king and says, "Lord, they've got us surrounded." Gilgamesh, with a little smile on his face, "Poor bastards." The epic doesn't tell us what he said to encourage his warriors or his people. Maybe he gave a rousing speech, or maybe he just stood on the wall and made it clear he was standing between his people and danger. Maybe he turned calmly toward the town ziggurat, its temple, raised his robes up and presented his ass to Aga and his host. Maybe his warriors joined him, laughing and shouting with the exuberance of young men at war. But whatever he did, it seems to have settled things down. Then he did something that seems baffling from the frame of a modern military leader for whom protecting the soldiers are always a prime consideration. He seems to have asked for a volunteer and sent him down to meet with Aga directly. It's not clear whether Aga called for a champion to be sent out, or whether Gilgamesh sent him down as a champion or a sacrifice or what, but a volunteer stepped up, a warrior named Bihartura, and went down to Aga. And here we get shades of what will come to be known as heroic warfare, all the way into the late Bronze Age of the Trojan War, and occasionally after. Battles might sometimes be decided by a one-on-one contest between the champions of each side. Even kings would sometimes step forward as their own champions and challenge the enemy king to single combat to determine who got to win the war. I know it's a little hard to imagine a modern-day leader doing something like that, but it happened. Occasionally. So Bihartura may have gone down as Gilgamesh's champion, intending to fight Aga's champion and decide the fight right then and there. If that was the deal, being selected was a huge honor and would have given Bihartura a chance to add a substantial honor onto what was probably already a stellar reputation. But if that's how Gilgamesh meant it to go, it's not how it went down. The epic tells us the Kishite army jumped on Bihartura and beat the shit out of him. They hit him, they struck him, they beat Bihartura's entire length, is what the epic tells us. Now this might have been a test of strength, a trial similar to the gauntlet practiced by some American tribes in which a challenger had to run between two long lines of people who would beat him as he passed. But it reads a little more like flat-ass torture. Because while he's being beaten, Aga keeps asking him, "Who's your king? And am I your king?" You can imagine how this beating looked to the warriors of Uruk, watching from the walls. Here they'd sent a brave man, one of their fellows, a brother in arms, to what they thought would be a fair test of his prowess. And this motherfucker was beating the shit out of him and trying to get him to deny his own king. These guys were probably itching for a good scrap by this point. So Gilgamesh told a bunch of them to grab their gear and go wait by the gate. Meanwhile, Bihartura wouldn't acknowledge any king but Gilgamesh, even under torture. And when Gilgamesh stepped up onto the wall in full view of the invading army, Aga tried again. He pointed up at Gilgamesh. "Slave," he said, "is that man your king?" I like to imagine Bhartara, half-conscious, bloody, following Aga's pointing finger, seeing Gilgamesh silhouetted on the wall with the sun behind him, giving a little smile with a split lip and broken teeth. Fuck yeah, that's my king. That's when Gilgamesh ordered the gate opened. Maybe Aga's army was all clustered up watching Aga torture Bhartara. Maybe they had taken off their god-awful hot armored capes and laid their shields aside. Maybe Gilgamesh didn't actually attack until after nightfall, when Aga and his men were asleep. Hell, maybe Gilgamesh attacked during an afternoon siesta. Or maybe he talked the entire population of Uruk into joining the attack. Whatever the reason, the epic makes it clear. Gilgamesh and his army kicked Kish's ass. Here's how the epic describes it. Gilgamesh cast down multitudes. He raised up multitudes. Multitudes were smeared with dust. All the nations were overwhelmed. The land's canal mouths were filled with silt. The barges' prows were broken, and he took Aga, the king of Kish, captive in the midst of his army. That's the part I was alluding to earlier. If all the nations were overwhelmed, that implies that more than just Uruk and Kish were present on that battlefield. If he simultaneously cast down and raised up multitudes, it might imply that he armed the whole population of Uruk, as I mentioned a minute ago. Or it might mean he inspired some of Aga's non-Kishite allies to turn against him, or both. And if he broke the barge's prows, he must have destroyed the boats that brought Aga and his army, or more likely some of their supplies, down from Kish. I got nothing on the silt in the canals, though. Not sure how a military victory could cause the canal mouths to fill up with silt, unless it was from all the dust raised in the battle, or maybe because all the guys whose job it was to dredge the silt out of the canal mouths now lay dead on the battlefield. I'm sure it's not just an example of an ancient text exaggerating the story of what happened. It couldn't possibly be that. But when the battle was over, Uruk appears to have won decisively, and his rival, Aga, the king of Kish, was kneeling in the dirt in front of him. So what did Gilgamesh do? Did he dash Aga's brains out with a battle mace, or cut his throat with a bronze dagger and watch his enemy's life bleed out into the dirt? Did he maybe stand back and hand the mace to Bhartara? Not according to the epic. The epic says he let him go, to return to Kish with what was left of his army. And archaeologists tell us that sometime around 2600 BCE, the empire of Kish fell, and Uruk became the dominant city-state of the Sumerian culture. So maybe this story describes a real battle, or maybe it's made up to explain why Kish faded into obscurity while Uruk rose to prominence. Or maybe the Babylonians made up the story 1,000 years later to help them justify their own conquest of the region. The truth is, whether or not the Siege of Uruk is the story of a real battle, it's a good starting point. We've already established that it wasn't the first battle in history, just the first one we have a written record of, as imperfect as that record might be. And the records are going to be this way for a while. Trying to describe a battle from the Bronze Age or even the Iron Age, or from a culture that didn't write down its history, is often an exercise in guesswork, trying to patch together the clues from oral tradition and archaeology and sociology into something like a narrative that makes sense. A lot of our battles are going to be this way, even well into the Middle Ages. You're going to get my interpretation of what might have happened as much as whatever history we have. That said, you're also going to get my evaluation of the leader's conduct of each battle, based on the principles of war. So let's get to it, shall we? Okay, so each principle is evaluated on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. I'll add a brief explanation for each grade. Mass is your capacity to bring overwhelming force to bear at the critical point on the battlefield. Aga seems to have done a good job of bringing what looked like overwhelming force to the battlefield, but his superior numbers didn't help him when it counted. Gilgamesh, by contrast, held his smaller force back until he saw an opportunity, then struck decisively. So Gilgamesh on this one gets a 5 out of 5. Aga gets a 3. Offensive. The degree to which you make things happen on the battlefield rather than waiting for your enemy to take action. Aga had every advantage here, except that the walls of Uruk stopped him. Then he seems to have stopped and waited for Gilgamesh to make the next move. Gilgamesh didn't go on the offensive at all until he saw his opportunity, then attacked with speed and violence as we've already established. So once again, Gilgamesh gets a 5. Aga in this case gets a 4. Surprise! Doing what your adversary doesn't expect. Aga did okay here since he seems to have arrived at Uruk before the city could get ready for him. Not waiting for Gilgamesh's answer to his message worked to his advantage, right up until Gilgamesh beat him in his own game by attacking when Aga's forces were focused elsewhere. So again, Gilgamesh gets a 5, Aga gets a 4. Security. This is keeping your forces from being surprised and retaining flexibility to respond to what your enemy does. Aga seems to have relied on his numbers to provide security. This is almost never a solid plan. Piss poor. Gilgamesh, however, kept his men inside the walls until he was ready to make his move, except for Bihartara, the poor bastard. So Gilgamesh gets a 4, Aga gets a 1 on this one. Maneuver is your capacity to maximize terrain advantages and attack your enemy where he's weakest. Not a lot of maneuver here on either side, at least not from what the epic tells us. Even Gilgamesh's surprise sortie through the city gates reads more or less like a straight-up frontal attack rather than any sort of maneuvering for advantage. On this one, they both did kind of crappy. Gilgamesh gets a 2 out of 5, Aga gets a 1 out of 5. Objective. Understanding what you're there to do and making sure your people understand it as well. The strategic objectives seem to have been pretty straightforward on both sides. Aga's was to compel Uruk to capitulate and agree to be part of his empire, while Gilgamesh's was to preserve Uruk's independence. Tactically, I think Gilgamesh has the advantage here. He seems to have focused his attack on capturing Aga. A sound goal when your adversary is leading a loose coalition that follows him personally and not some mutual target or ideology. So Gilgamesh here gets a 4 out of 5, Aga gets a 3. Unity of command. Every soldier on the battlefield should be taking their orders from a single person, represented by a clearly defined chain of command. Solid on both sides. Aga was clearly in charge of the Kishites and their allies, and after questioning Gilgamesh initially, the Uruk city fathers got behind him and don't appear to have wavered in their support. So both of them get a 5 on this one. Simplicity. The less your troops have to think about what to do next, the more likely they are to successfully work as a team. Again, neither side seems to have gone in the fight with an overly complex plan. Aga's was probably the more complex because he had to coordinate the efforts of several city-states toward his own goals. But he's hardly the only leader in history to have faced that obstacle. So on this one, I give them both a 4. And finally, economy of force. Your ability to protect your own forces as you act against the enemy. It looks like Aga just attacked all at once with everything he had until his forces got to the city walls, which makes sense since he was throwing armed troops against soft targets and he wanted to get to the city quickly. But we have nothing to indicate whether or not he held anything back in the case of a counterattack. The way his army crumbled in the face of Gilgamesh's surprise attack would suggest he didn't. Gilgamesh sent only one man out to make initial contact with the enemy, and didn't commit the rest of his force until he knew exactly where to commit them to maximum effect. So Gilgamesh on this one gets a 4, Aga gets a 1. So our total scores. Gilgamesh ends up with 38 out of 45. And Aga ends up with 26 out of 45. So Gilgamesh is the clear winner here in terms of military theory. Makes sense since he's the hero of the epic and all. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll tell your friends about us. And come back next week when we tackle our first battle that wouldn't have fit in your Western Civ class. That's the Battle of Bangshuan, China, 2500 BCE. I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. See you next time.